No 7 deadly words this time, and no request for money.
Of the Carmel Public Library Foundation, and together with Harrison Memorial Library, the librarians, and our group of volunteers, we welcome you to the final lecture this season of local history. We have a good program planned for you starting in September, and we hope you'll continue to support the series. The Frank and Eva Buck Foundation and Robert and Lacey Buck fund this program, and the Henry Meads William Local History Room at the Park Branch exists because of their generosity. Lacey's traveling in France right now, or we would give her our normal round of applause. Tonight, we are so lucky to have Ray March with us. Ray is on a blitz with his book. He's appearing in several places on the peninsula this week. Normally we have Tuesday evenings reserved for local history, but we nailed him for Monday night, and we're so happy that he could be here. I'm going to do just a very brief bio. Ray grew up here, but some of you might not know about him. He was educated at San Francisco State with degrees in English literature and humanities. He's a lifelong journalist. He's worked on newspapers in Europe and the United States. He worked for the LA Herald Examiner, and he was editor of the Carmel Pinecone.
Past tense.
He's firm about that. His articles and essays have appeared in Time, the New York Times, and the San Francisco Chronicle. He is co-director of the Surprise Valley Writers Conference in Modoc. And the logo for the Writers Conference is a rural setting for serious writers. And it will take place this year, September 13th to September 16th. He is editor of the Modoc Independent News, a monthly newspaper, with his wife Barbara. He is a former National Book Award nominee. River in Ruin, the book that Ray will be talking about tonight, is a complete examination of the recent history of the Carmel River. Ray has known the river since childhood. This book is a personal explanation and analysis of the forces that brought the river to its current situation. River in Ruin offers a clear explanation of how the Carmel River's problems developed and makes a convincing case for urgent action to fix them. River in Ruin is published by the University of Nebraska Press and is available tonight to be purchased and signed by Ray. We also want to invite you, while we have 1 second, May 22nd, we have the last of our art and literary series. Jerry Fielder will be here. He is the curator of the Yosef Karsh portraits, the black and white fabulous celebrity portraits that we all grew up with in Life magazine. So that's May 22nd. And now please join us in welcoming Ray March.
Are there any questions? I spoke yesterday at Colton Hall, and I didn't even get my whole act done before we got into various discussions, but I think the introduction probably covers everything, and some of you probably already have the book. But I'd like to, first of all, introduce my wife again, Barbara March is over there. She's a poet and journalist and my partner. A little story about Barbara I'll get to, and sitting next to her is William O'Daly, He's a member of our faculty at the Surprise Valley Writers Conference. He's the preeminent translator of the Nobel poet Pablo Neruda, 8 volumes. He's worn out. And I think some of you may appreciate this. When we returned to the Monterey Peninsula in about 1983, I've returned here many times. I have to admit to sort of a love-hate relationship with my hometown, but we get along. We moved here, and Barbara had her name put in the telephone book under her maiden name. And the day the book came out, she got a telephone call, and it was this gruff voice. And he said to her, he's calling, and he says to her, "Who is this?" She said, "This is Barbara Liolo." "Who's this?" "This is Barney Liolo, 3-time mayor of Carmel, her father's cousin." Immediately, Barney took Barbara into the family, went to family reunions. He'd call up her dad on the telephone and speakerphone at the house, and they'd speak Italian together. It was wonderful. When I was the editor of the Carmel Pinecone for one glorious year, it was a muckraking period, and some people couldn't. Anyway, it didn't appear that there was going to be any competition for the office of mayor. And so I editorialized that this can't possibly be Carmel. And if you think about the history, I'm a big fan of Perry Newberry in that period. And so I editorialized that it would be a shame if there wasn't at least another candidate to run for mayor. Barney Liolo stepped forward, and he almost won. He lost by just, half a dozen, 12 votes or something like that. So anyway, it's just a little aside. I'll figure out where I am. My design, when I started to prepare for these talks, was to give each of the audiences, and I'm speaking in different locations, a little bit about my history so that I can make a point that I'm going to try to get to eventually. And so yesterday I started at Colton Hall. And I came to Monterey originally. That's where we went first, my mother and I, in 1938. And lived in a house across the street from Colton Hall. So it was a great honor for me to be there where our Constitution was drafted in 1849, and it was an incredible experience to stand up there and talk. I only had one complaint. The house or building that we lived in, they have a wrong name on it. I thought that it should have been March Apartments, and it's the Panetta Building. So I do know Leon, and when I see him again, I'll probably speak to him about that. So my plan is then tonight to give you a little bit of background as to what my experience has been here, so then we can get to a little bit of the purpose behind writing this book and the purpose of writing creative nonfiction. So, and then when I finish that, you can have at me or at each other. I don't care. But I do plan to read some. Does anybody have a book? Do you have anything that's earmarked? I think it's in my bag, Bill. It's got it's got those 100 little tabs on it.
Oh,
Yeah.
well, you know this book, right? You're familiar with it.
Sort of. I've lived with it a long time. Anyway, to continue my story that I started at Colton Hall, after arriving in Monterey in 1938, we moved to Carmel in 1949. And that's when my parents bought their first house in Carmel. And in the process, I transferred in my freshman year from Monterey High School to Carmel High School. So if I were to run for office, I kind of have it covered. You know, we're getting a little older now. But anyway, I was in the middle of my freshman year, and the house that they bought was called the Papoose. And I'd say, don't ask. I don't know why that was called that. I have no idea. But the house was located, and you'll love this because you know how directions are in Carmel. The house was located on Santa Fe Street, south of Ocean, north of Mountain View, on the east side of the street. But I don't remember exactly how many houses from the corner it was. I should have gone back and probably counted those. It was white stucco house. My father, in those days, worked at Glennon's. And now Glennon's was a men's clothing store downtown. And my mother, it seemed to me, she worked part-time or from time to time as a secretary at the Naval Postgraduate School in those days. She would come home and she would ask me questions like, Ray, do you know the difference? She was a secretary to let's see, what was he? Professor of engineering. She'd come home and she'd say, Ray, do you know the difference between fission and fusion? I was only 15 or something. Of course, I didn't. I was moderately intrigued. River and Rune is dedicated to my mother, who was extremely patient with raising a teenager in those days. For the most part, my high school years in Carmel were rather idyllic, and I have classmates here tonight who will vouch for that. I was in the chorus line of Rick Maston's musicals at the Forest Theater. Cole Weston directed some of those musicals, and he was always grumpy back then, or at least I thought he was. When I knew him personally and closer in later years, I realized he wasn't really grumpy. He just acted like he was. I told him one time that he scared the hell out of me. You know, he was innocent. How could I possibly do that? Anyway, when we were in high school, Easter week was a major time for us. It occupied all our teenage minds because that was the week that the Piedmont kids came down with their chaperones for one big beach party, usually at 13th Street. And in 1949, under the watchful eye of Coach George Mozoff, the 6th period PE class finished the construction of the Carmel Youth Center. Well, I'm taking too much credit. We didn't really construct the Carmel Youth Center. We cleaned it up after the workers at the end of the day. But we took great pride in that, and besides that, it got us out of running around the track. Bing Crosby was the man and much of the money behind the creation of the Carmel Youth Center. I recently read on the Youth Center's website that it was one of 200 youth centers founded by Bing and is the only youth center of those 200 still in existence. Now, that's something to be proud of. I particularly am. It's nice to see history still thriving in that sense. Bob Updike was elected the first president. He became our fire chief, as I recall, and I was the first vice president. And I have no idea how that happened. The youth center was a great place to hang out. Jack and Bonnie Giles were our underappreciated surrogate parents. While Bonnie ran the youth center from stem to stern, Jack played hearts with us after school when there wasn't a football or basketball practice, and spoiled that we were, there were pool tables in the basement. We originated the Carmel Youth Follies, which were staged right here in the old Sunset School auditorium, which is where our high school graduation class held the ceremonies. After originating the Carmel Youth Follies, Jack and Bonnie Giles would go with Bing down to Hollywood and pick out costumes from his movies that were used by the kids in the Youth Follies. It was an incredible amount of support from somebody like that. Probably, and I'm looking around, I'm not sure I see him, probably one of the most important people in Carmel at that time, besides Bing, when we were teenagers, was the chief of police, Clyde Clawman. And I say that because one time, Sam Robinson, whose father was an attorney and on the city council, told me, he said, "Ray, we've got a job up in Carmel Valley. There's a lady up there who needs her furniture moved." And I said, "That's wonderful. How are we going to do it? We don't have a truck." Sam said, "I know where there's a truck." The truck was a bright purple Ford pickup that looked a lot like a, what do they call it, the garden farmer's market type of truck. It belonged to, where's Karen? There's Karen. It belonged to Kurt von Meyer, Karen von Meyer Christensen right there, her older brother. It was parked in front of the police station. We didn't see that to be a problem. We went and it wouldn't start. And Kurt had removed an item from it that wouldn't, so we couldn't start it, so we went out and replaced the item. And we got the truck started, and we spent the day moving this lady's furniture. And when we were driving back into town, you couldn't miss Kurt's truck. We were driving back into town, coming down Ocean Avenue, the hill. Who's coming up from the opposite direction? Chief Clyde Clawman. We stopped at the stop sign there, and it was Sam, Ray, yes, Chief. Kurt's looking for his truck. You'd better put it back where you found it. That's exactly what we were going to do, Chief. And we headed right back and put the truck right in front of the police station. Nothing else was said except for Kurt. Kurt wasn't happy with us at all, and he stayed mad at Sam and I for quite a long time. Today, under those same circumstances, we'd probably be serving time for auto theft. So I've always appreciated the understanding that Chief Clawman had for us kids. I guess you could say that I grew up privileged in Carmel. I just didn't know it. Which leads me to the writing of River and Rune and the story of the Carmel River. I tried to sneak some of these stories past my editor at the University of Nebraska Press, but when you read the book, and some of you already have, you'll soon see that for the most part I wasn't successful. I do have a scene in the book about the old sand plant at the mouth of the river, and after many years, for those of you who haven't read the book yet, I do a scene there where after we graduated from high school, we had a little beach party down there and decided that we were going to run the levers of the sand plant and dredge sand up, and somehow or other we used an oily rag that we lit so we could see what we were doing, and the next day my father said, "Have you heard?" "What's that?" "The sand plant burned down." Yeah. Anyway, many years later, this is not a confession. A statute of limitations, right. Many years later, I announced at a class reunion, Carmel High, 1953, that we had won, this was a facetious announcement on my part, that we had won an Environmental Beautification Award for burning down the sand plant. Everybody cheered. So I've told you a little of my local background because as a journalist and the author of nonfiction books, I believe that to write about a subject, you have to be of that place. It doesn't matter whether the writing is fiction or nonfiction. In my daily work as a journalist, I follow the principle of truth, of getting at the truth as closely as I can. This principle is guided by the philosophy that in getting at the truth and publishing it as accurately as possible, My readers will be better informed, better educated, and able to better govern themselves. In today's political climate, that's not an easy assignment. The press has lost a lot of credibility, thanks to Spiro Agnew. Anyway. But it's true regardless of subject. To give a historical record of the degradation of the Carmel River, a record based on primary sources, archived documents, personal experience, and qualified experts, is my effort to get at the truth and get everyone dependent on the river's waters a better opportunity to govern themselves when it comes to the politics of our water resources. If you live on the Monterey Peninsula, and I imagine all of us here do, there's a good chance that the Carmel River is a daily part of your life, whether you know it or not. And I hope and I'm sure that you know it, particularly these days with the discussions that are going on with the desal plants. The river is in the water you drink. The river's politics are in the newspaper you read, the TV news you watch, and many times its presence is there in who you vote for and who you vote against. It's in the water bill that comes in the mail and the golf course you play. If you're a steelhead fisherman, the river is in your prayers for the fish's return in great, unbelievable numbers. The river is in your daily planning if you are a river activist, working to bring it back to its glory days, and if not its glory days, at least a wondrous restoration of what once was. The same is true for those who are pro-dam. People who are pro-dam think about dams all the time. The Carmel River is in your consciousness and your subconsciousness every day. I'm sure it has also a special place in your childhood memory, as it has in mine. I recently had an email exchange with a friend who now lives in Australia. But he went to Carmel High, as I did, and the first thing he wrote me after reading the book, and I quote, "I remember when the river flowed all year long." Some will say, and you've heard this, it never flowed all year long. And my answer is, so what? Yeah, that's how my friend remembers the river. That's how I remember the river. And that's how everyone I grew up with remembers the river. The first warm spring day would find us not in our classrooms, but at the river. The Carmel River was a recreational playground. Maybe some of you learned to swim at the lagoon when you were a kid, or you went there to walk your dog. Maybe you do that now. Or just to watch the wave action at Undertow Beach. Some of you will say, it still is a recreational playground. And I'll say, I'm glad to hear that. I make these opening remarks with the thought that they may explain to a degree why I came to write River and Rune, the story of the Carmel River. If you ask a mountain climber, why do you climb mountains? He's going to say, because they are there. If you ask me, why did you write a book about the Carmel River? I have to say, because it's not there. Because it's not there. If you don't know why the river is not there, this book will tell you in no uncertain terms. In a sense, the story of the Carmel River is biblical. We, all of us, have taken from the forbidden river not once, but far too many times. But that's a mere metaphor. And in reality, the Carmel River is far from a metaphor. River and Rune is intended to be as complete a historical record of the river in both its local as well as its statewide context as possible. The purpose is to give the reader a broad perspective of river quote, river politics. We're hearing it all the time right today. Reading River and Rune will lead you to seeing the deja vu occurring today. With this perspective, you can step back, or you should step back, and say, oh no, not again. You know, the point being, how long is this going to be delayed? How long is this going to go on? How many games is Cal-Am going to play? You know, when's the PUC going to sit on top of Cal-Am instead of being their buddy, and so forth and so forth. And maybe you will feel empowered to do something on behalf of your river. Call it an awareness. There's a chance for restoration of the river and of our own spirit. We must not forget our history. To put the Carmel River in greater perspective with major river issues in California, we're not alone. Let me read this from the quote page of River and Rune. And the quote is by Kevin Urquhart, Senior Fisheries Biologist for the Monterey Peninsula Water Management District. And I quote, other than the Sacramento-San Joaquin River Delta, sounds like more than one, it's one, the Colorado River, 2, the Truckee-Tahoe water system, 3, the Carmel River water system is probably the most actively and complexly managed water system in California. It's amazing. This is a consequence of how little water there is to allocate, the attempts to avoid environmental harm, the endangered species present, and the multiple jurisdictions involved. How did we ever get into this mess? You'll find out. To further put the Carmel River in relationship to these other 3, by comparison to the Sacramento Delta, the Colorado River, the Tahoe-Truckee water system, which combined are water suppliers for millions of water consumers, both urban and agriculture, the Little Carmel River supplies a mere fraction of those numbers, and yet look at the company it's keeping. But the Carmel River has lots of lesser-known river company. When I write, I put little quotes around. River company. And it's not the only river listed as endangered by the American Rivers Group. An incredibly complex water rights issue is literally raging in the Klamath Basin, which straddles southern Oregon and northern California. At issue, the removal of PG&E dams from the Klamath River and water limitations placed on farmers in order to protect the salmon. And I'm oversimplifying it. Like the Carmel River, the Klamath is also on American River's list of endangered rivers. Puda Creek, which is up in Winters, close to Davis, has many of the same problems as the Carmel River, and the Puda Creek Council was formed in 1988 to restore the creek to its former water flow and save the creek habitat. And I recently received this note from a reader, and I quote, River and Rune, she wrote, speaks for all our rivers and makes me ache for my middle fork of the Feather River. Thank you. The key there is my middle fork, my river, my water. And this from another reader. I grew up in the rural country of the San Joaquin Valley, where a lot of our entertainment was swimming in the tree-lined, pristine canals that crisscrossed the county. Now those same canals, creeks, water holes are either filled with diapers, trash, leaves, sediment, or needles used by drug users. The whole county is filthy. And the Board of Supervisors and City Councils are constantly asking, what can we do to improve our county? You may say, that didn't happen to our river, but it did. Just different trash went into it. Each of you are here, no doubt, can tell many similar stories. You have friends someplace else who will tell you the same thing. So I have to quickly interject before you all get out and rush for the door. The book is not all doom and gloom, nor is it a legal paper. I don't think I could have written it or taken the years they did to research it. I'd like to interject there. Much of the research was with the support of Dennis Copeland, who is the archivist at the California Room in the Monterey Public Library. The book traces Father Juanipero Serra's trials with getting water from the Carmel River to irrigate crops at the Carmel Mission. The book picks up the pace with the arrival of Charles Crocker. Charles Crocker, all right. Charles Crocker, all right. And the Hotel Del Monte and its reliance on the river for water. Then it addresses the sardine industry. Some of us remember when we were the capital of the sardine industry. We weren't, but we called ourselves that. And the use of the water, moving on to the growth of golf courses and water consumption, then the story behind the demise of the steelhead, and finally to the 1999 Kirk Creek fire that burned into the river's watershed. Of course, there's an epilogue that is more up to date in its information on the status of the river. Why did I stop in 1999? It's because that's where I started. I wrote the last chapter first. I couldn't miss writing and being there when that fire was burning. We lived in Cashel at the time, and very close to the fire. Sandwiched among the chapters are what I call, and pardon me, but I think they're delightful. One is on the formation of Carmel and its dealings with the Monterey County Waterworks. Now, doesn't that sound like sort of a bureaucratic government agency? Monterey County Waterworks? It wasn't. It was owned by Del Monte Properties Company. The other chapter is what I call the surreptitious move by the village's co-founders, particularly Frank Devendorf, who secretly joined the newspaper editor at the Pinecone, Perry Newberry, who at that time was also the mayor of Carmel. You may know in your own history that Perry Newberry ran on a platform that if you want this, that, and the other thing, don't vote for me. And he won, of course. The issue was the pressure that the reluctant Monterey County Waterworks, owned by SFB Morse's Del Monte Properties Company, to supply water to two women, only two, who came from Oakland to make their home in Carmel. And where was that? I went by there on the way down here. It was in what was called the 4th edition, Alta Street. Those of you who know coming in Carpenter, you can take the back way into Carmel and skip the tourist traffic for the most part until they get on to the secrets. The house is still there. There was a huge issue. It took them a year to get water. In the meantime, Frank Devendorf hauled water to these two ladies by horse, wagon. I call the chapter Carmel's Theater of Water. Carmel's so theatrical. With that, I'd like to read a couple, but I'm open now. I'm hoping that you'll allow me to take a little drink of water here, and I'll be happy to either answer questions right away at any time, or I'll read you a few excerpts from the book, and that may stir some other questions that you have. So think your questions while I wet bottled water. Yeah. Do you have a question? I'm sorry. Okay. I think they were talking to each other, and I thought they wanted a question. All right. I wanted to say, when I first started to speak tonight, and I'll say it now, I mentioned the fact that our high school class used the old Sunset Auditorium, and that's where we graduated from high school. There were some of us who were told by our teachers and administration that we were not going to amount to much. And guess who one of those was? It was me and a couple others. And that didn't motivate me, didn't motivate me at all. However, you may recall, and this is a number of years back, and I always remember this, when JFK was inaugurated, Shirley MacLaine sang and danced a song called "If My Friends Could See Me Now." And I'd kind of like to wish that some of my teachers could see me now. I'll just read from the prologue first. This is kind of in keeping with what I've been talking about and what our experience was. On a summer evening between semesters at college, my friends and I gathered at Undertow Beach near the lagoon where the Carmel River enters Carmel Bay. The evening was nippy. A high fog hovered overhead. So in a tight, protected valley of sand carved out long ago by an old cable-driven dredge, we built a little campfire of driftwood and we drank rank red wine. Above and behind us loomed the shrouded gray wooden shed of the abandoned sand plant, where, when it was in operation, the dredge returned its load of sand from just offshore to be dumped down a chute into a waiting truck below. The old squatter, who used to live in a shack hidden by bushes next to the sand plant, was gone, perhaps evicted. Even his shack was gone. So we were bothering no one, intruding only on the night, the waves crashing in front of us in the limits of our adventure. One of us thought we should see if we could get the dredge running. Like little boys angrily breaking sticks, there's a surfacing of bravado and desire for momentary violence that wine conjures up in young men. Illuminated by a burning rag, the girls watched us, and I have classmates here, and every single one of them deny being at this party. Carly, Carol, Karen. I'm looking back there. Joni. Yeah, thank you, Karen. Yeah. Karen's just absolved Joni Mitchell. She's back there against the ball. Okay. Then we randomly shifted long iron levers back and forth and drove the dredge and its jerking cables out into the seafloor and back again, snuffing out the fire in the little valley of sand like a puff of breath on a match. And then we were through, spent, disinterested, the campfire gone out, and the valley of sand cleanly dredged. We left. The next day, after sleeping in late, I learned that the old dilapidated sand plant had burned down. It didn't take long for the sheriff to find a lost identification card belonging to one of us. I will not reveal who that was. That to this day, I'm not going to tell. It wasn't mine. With that, the whole story came out. Heroically shielding the girls who had been there, as was expected in those days, we took full blame and all financial responsibility. We, the boys, would divide the damages between us, whatever they were. We were heroic in those days. And we also danced differently then too. But not all of us had the money, and the choices we were offered were few. We could find ways to work and repay the rich owner of the old sand plant, or we could join the army. I'm a veteran. Two of us joined up many years later, and an official class reunion, and I mentioned this earlier, I announced facetiously that our high school class, Carmel High, 1953, had been given an Environmental Beautification Award for burning down the old sand plant. Everyone cheered and applauded. Now at that site, at the mouth of the Carmel River, near its lagoon, there is a California state beach. It's called Carmel River State Beach. Where the sand plant once stood is a bank of public restrooms. Talk about beautification. We still call it Undertow Beach, but we don't go there often. In retrospect, life on the Carmel River was an idyllic time, a romantic time, as summers of our youth so often are when we reflect back on those unencumbered years. Idealistically, those of us who relied on the river trusted that it would be there forever. We were intimately familiar with the river, but sadly, with that intimacy eventually came a community neglect. At the time, it was something we failed to see. Even in the irony of rewarding ourselves with a fictitious Environmental Beautification Award. You're mesmerized, I can tell. At Colton Hall yesterday, I don't know if I got through that first reading before the action started. Let's see here. To Monday, August 8th, 1921. On that date, Ann Nash and Dorothy Bassett, with all their belongings in tow, boarded a southbound train for Monterey. The two hospital occupational therapy instructors from Oakland were moving to Carmel. Dorothy's mother was already living there, and her brother Willard arrived later to start the newspaper, the Carmel Symbol. CYMBAL, in case you're not familiar with it. When the two women arrived in Monterey, they stopped to check on their baggage and missed the connecting stage. So they started walking over the hill to Carmel. Talk about intrepid. Luck was with them, and they hitched a ride to the lot in the 4th edition that they planned to purchase from Frank Devendorf. That night, their first in Carmel, and against the local rules, these were real future Carmelites, against the local rules. That's the first rule, is to be against the local rules. They heated soup over a tiny fire in the dirt road and slept on a bed of pine needles. This is the house up on Alta. By Friday of their first week, they were inquiring about the water supply to their lot. People still are. From her diary. Rose at 5 after a delightful night's sleep on our pine needles. Ann Nash began writing in her diary. To the beach to cook our breakfast, and then for a long walk by the valley and the woods on the other side. Went to the real estate office, but Mr. Devendorf will be back tomorrow. The rest of my baggage came at 3, and we arranged our temporary camp, heated beans, and had a scrumptious dinner. The next day, Devendorf showed them around the undeveloped 4th edition, informing them that he doubted he'd be able to get water to the lot the women were most interested in buying. But he would let them know. Ann and Dorothy began to settle themselves into their camp. During their first week in Carmel, they regularly went to the glistening white sand dunes at the beach where, over an open fire, they cooked breakfast of scrambled eggs and toast and then lingered over the warming coals before heading to town in search of Devendorf and an answer to their water needs. Each day the question of water went unanswered, but Nash and Bassett were undaunted. They returned to their lot of choice and talked about their house and garden plans before preparing dinner over canned heat. It tells the whole thing. It's all right there. This one couple, these two ladies, and what they went through. It just sums it up in an incredible manner. Now, Devendorf, and I know many of you were here when Jack Galante talked about Frank Devendorf, I believe, or probably some of you were. Devendorf was not a typical realtor or something. He nurtured the people who came here. He's the one who was responsible for trees down the middle of the street or taking the road around the trees. He was an unusual force in a small community like this, and he had the dream of what this village would become, and it did become that until second homes started taking place. But anyway, it took a year for the two ladies to get their water. 1 year. They're camping out. They're drawing up their plans. They're trying to get started. They get a person who can build for them, etc. Devendorf, in the meantime, was developing a plan to get them water. And it's sort of like today, except it's different. And that is that there are a lot of politics involved, and he had to take and manipulate the politics. Essentially, he had to manipulate SFB Morse, our visionary out in Del Monte Forest, to bring water to those two ladies because it was contracted that they had to do that. And the attorneys for SFB Morse says, why should we bring water to them? There's only two people out there. It's going to cost us too much money. In March 1922, with his plan finally in place, and I do not want, in case you haven't read the book yet, I'm not going to tell you how it ends, Devendorf saw his opportunity. He asked C.S. Olmsted, working for SFB Morse at the Monterey County Waterworks, he was the superintendent in Pacific Grove, to furnish an estimate for extending a line to the Carmel pumping plant. Olmsted, springing his own trap, said it could be done for $1,488, and then handed the issue over to his company attorney. They do that today. Devendorf then made the first of two well-calculated risks. First, he consulted with his son-in-law, Earl Hofeld, a partner in the San Francisco law firm of Morrison, Dunn, and Brobeck, who was Jane Galante's father. It's all connected. They agreed to file a complaint against Morse's Monterey County Waterworks with the California Railroad Commission. That preceded the PUC. I always thought it was kind of wonderful, the California Railroad Commission, with the big four running the railroads. And anyway, and they charged that the water company, Morse's Water Company, failed to fulfill its obligation to furnish water to the 4th edition. This was in March. On April 18th, Hofeld had the necessary legal papers ready and mailed them back to Carmel from San Francisco. The packet of legal documents also contained a draft of a letter from the mayor of Carmel to sign. Devendorf had thought it all out. Part of his plan was that his pal, Perry Newberry, editor of the Carmel Pinecone and recently elected mayor, would step forward with his political office and influence of the newspaper behind him and form a united front against the Monterey County Waterworks. All right. Newberry went along with Devendorf's plan, and no one needed to know otherwise. All Devendorf had to do was wait for the official letter from the mayor of Carmel to arrive at his office, and he would swing in the action. And arrive it did. And I quote the letter, "Gentlemen, it has come to our attention," this is the letter from the city of Carmel, "it has come to our attention that certain residents and householders in the 4th addition to Carmel by the Sea have been unable to obtain water service from the Monterey County Waterworks, although they have repeatedly requested and demanded such service, and that it has been necessary to haul water at great expense to meet their daily needs, and also that other purchasers from you in said addition dare not build upon or attempt to occupy and enjoy their property for fear of inability to obtain water service from said company. Could say Cal-Am. Anyway, although you have, on their behalf, and this is you as the Carmel Development Company, requested and demanded such service be provided. As said fourth edition lies within the area entitled to water service from the Monterey County Waterworks, and the failure of said company to render such service not only works a hardship and injustice upon property owners in that edition, but prevents, it reads like an attorney wrote it, but prevents the normal growth and upbuilding of that part of town, and therefore amounts to an injury to all of us, as we are of the opinion that prompt and vigorous steps should be taken to compel the furnishing of service requested, water, and to that end, we hereby offer our fullest cooperation and assistance. Okay, it's being set up. The letter, dated April 22nd, 1922, was from the office of the mayor and was unsigned. It was addressed to the Carmel Development Company, attention Frank Devendorf. And I'll skip a little bit here. Remarkably, and I love this is so pure Carmel, remarkably and inexplicably, there were 3 mayors of Carmel in April of 1922. 2 of them were short term. And they left office early in the month. And a third, Perry Newberry, who had been newly elected to a 2-year term. He had just won the mayor's seat on a controlled growth platform. So I don't want to tell you what happened there because it's a wonderful, it's very theatrical, but I can tell you that the 2 ladies won. There wouldn't be water up there now, probably. But those were the pioneers, literally the pioneers who put the pressure on for Carmel to get water as they were contracted to do from the Monterey County Waterworks. And the reason that part of this came about was that Carmel decided to get out of the water business. They had trouble finding sources of water. They drilled wells at the mission. The mission wouldn't sell them some property that they wanted to drill wells on, so they tried other locations. They had a pumping plant. They had a storage tank, but they got out of it, and they actually sold their interest to the Monterey County Waterworks. And I was saying this morning and talking at the Hopkins Marine Station, or we were there for 3 hours, and I had 2 minutes? Your new mayor took up all the rest of the time. But I asked him if he had an ID that whether he was old enough to run for mayor. You can get away with that, when you're my age and you've been here before he was. So there's plenty here I can go into. I don't want to take up all the time by constantly reading. I've read this already. I'm hopeful if there's, I can tell you this. This question came up this morning at Hopkins. How did I get those 2 chapters on Carmel? And I have to say there was a lot of luck involved. First of all, the development company chapter, Jane Galante, being the granddaughter of the founder of Carmel, she had all the files, the Carmel Development Company files, all of them. And she opened them up to me in her Carmel Valley home. We'd have sandwiches. We'd, take notes. We'd talk, and we discussed, what she should do with the files. At some point, something would have to be done, and I'd like to take some credit for this. I convinced her not to take them to someplace like Bancroft, where they just sort of decay away in a file someplace in storage, And maybe she took my advice, I don't know, but she gave them to the city of Carmel. And Jack, her son, is one of the members who oversee those files. And I couldn't thank her more for that. It's so important to have that kind of history that's available, easily available to us. The other thing on the diaries of the two ladies, I was walking near the library one day. I'd started work on the book. This was before we moved away, which is still another story. And I ran into Lady Vermeer, who you may know, Lady Knight Vermeer. She was ahead of me by a year, I think, in high school. And she worked at the library. And she said, "Ray, guess what I have?" Well, I had no idea. I thought maybe she was joking. She had a great sense of humor. And she told me that she had come into possession and inherited the collection of the diaries by this writer, 7 years of diary that they took and they wrote the first years that they came to Carmel. The first thing we did was ask, can we use some of this material? And we put it in our magazine. Barbara was the publisher of Buying the Best, which we owned at that time. It's no longer being published. And we did that. We put that into a piece into the magazine on Frank Devendorf. And I think you've seen the picture. I think maybe Jack Galante might have used that. Devendorf is leaning or put his arm against a tree. It's a perfect symbol of a tree hugger. Tree huggers would love it, you know, and he's like this against a tree. In reading the diaries, I came across this whole episode that we put in the book. And I asked Lainey if I could use that. She said yes. In the business of publishing, there's a technicality. You have to have permission of everything you're quoted in here. For example, I quote a poem by Robinson Jeffers. And I'm a big fan of Robinson Jeffers. He was writing poetry at Tor House when I was in high school. If I hadn't been so afraid of him, I probably would have gone down and told him I was a fan. But I didn't. When we came to get permissions, and I did that, I know many, many members of the Jeffers family. They actually live up where we do, grandchildren. There's a Garth Jeffers still alive. He works for the BLM. He's the son of Garth Jeffers, Robinson Jeffers' twin son. There's a brother up there whose name happens to be Robinson Jeffers. It's very weird for me. The rest of them, they don't know the difference. I had to track down. Lainey had passed away. Her husband, Roger Vermeer, has been placed in a caretaking home. And I was fortunate through other classmates that I could find their son. And I found him in Marin County. We got in touch. He gave me the permission to use it. I could never have done that particular chapter if it hadn't been for the permission that Lainey's family gave me. And that's sort of the story behind that. How many more questions do we have?
Right.
Yes. There's a question over here. You're the starter.
The question I have is a little sort of indirect, but one of the big problems we have with the river is the pumping from the Carmel River aquifer, which is sort of an imaginary thing to some extent, because there's so many preemptive water rights associated with pumping from the river. But there are at least two developments that have occurred along the river. One is Carmel Valley Ranch, the other is September Ranch now, who hypothesized that they had their own separate aquifers. We know it's been proven totally that it's all associated with the Carmel River aquifer. So I don't know if you've dealt with that in the book or not. That was my question. Did you deal with the aquifer itself and the fact that that's one of the major issues really that's causing the ruin of the river? It's just the pumping from that aquifer.
Oh yes, there's incredible detail on the whole process and the sequence of events of Cal-Am being instructed by the PUC to, restrict or reduce the pumping from those aquifers. It's in the book. There's also, I think, in the epilogue, because I had to write the epilogue at the very last. That was to make it the most current part. The book ends in 1999, so typically you would not have seen that. But there's actually there's a section in the book that deals with that, and also I'd say establishes or reveals that the Monterey Peninsula was a late comer when it comes to the environmental protection of that river. California and other locations had already started. At that time, the Monterey Peninsula was still concerned, as a population, still concerned with getting its water and not with what that was doing to the river. Now that's starting to change. Yes, yes.
Hi, I'm with the Carmel River Watershed Conservancy, and I thought you did a terrific job on the history of the river, a really intriguing history of the river. But the title sounds like the river's in ruin right now, and I think a more apt title would be River in Restoration, because there are 50 projects going on right now in the river to restore it in many ways. So I think that River in Ruin is a little bit more like a yellow journalism than accurate today.
I take that as a compliment. Let me answer your question. First of all, I don't agree with you. But secondly, let me tell you what my working title was. My working title was Pulling the Plug on Paradise. Now, the reason for that is that we have been reading our press clips for so long and believing them. Somebody tells us we live in paradise, we must live in paradise. Somebody tells us that we are shoulder to shoulder with celebrities, we must be pretty important. And it goes on from there and on from there. And so that was the working title. I did title this book. They asked me to change that title, and that's what I came up with. It's a title that I think encompasses the history of the river. Imagine it's a matter of what tense you want to look at it. I do make up for some of this in the epilogue. And if you read the book, I think that's true. Yeah. I can't change it now. Yes.
Well, do you have any hope for the river?
Absolutely. Absolutely.
Have you any suggestions?
If you didn't have hope for the restoration of a river, then how can you possibly have hope for anything? You might as well give up. The river is symbolic. The river is part of us. Running water is amazing. And I'm not talking about water coming out of a faucet.
So, do you have any suggestions?
I'm the messenger. Now that sounds like, don't shoot the messenger. Yeah. The point is well taken. The job in doing this book was to give everybody information that they can start to make some decisions for themselves. Now, my personal feeling is that we haven't been active enough. We've got to start being active. And you're starting to see that now. It's a political thing too, partially because a desal plant, for example, is probably going to have a public support and a public entity involved with it, right? If they can hold up the Monterey County ordinance. So that's where we are. I think we've been too complacent, and I say that because this is my home. I don't live here now, but I've lived here all my life. I worked on the Monterey Herald. I worked on the Salinas Californian. I was the editor of the Pinecone. I know my history here, and I'm part of that too. We took it for granted, and now it's gone. Now, what are we thinking about? It's amazing. I heard this morning. Now we're looking at, could we get water from the Arroyo Seco? Could we go over and steal water from Greenfield? Could we go over to Moss Landing? Can we go to Castroville? Can we find other water, other sources how are we going to take and fill this empty aquifer, without not damaging, but certainly taking water from the river that should be replaced. It's amazing when you think about that, because for years it was just a microcosm. It was just our problem, how are we going to get water from our river. Now, the Monterey Peninsula, politically at least, is acting just like the state of Nevada, where Las Vegas is going clear up into the northeastern part of the state to pipe water all the way to Las Vegas, so they can run their fountains and they can mow their lawns, whatever it might be. You're in a heap of trouble if it keeps going that way, because if you move out to this here, if you try to figure out how we're going to get, let's try to figure out how we can get water from the Salinas River. Okay, what happens for the next generation? Where do we go? Yes?
To what degree do you think that the proposed desalinization plant would alleviate the burden? The desalinization plant, the Nadaraga is proposing, would that ease the burden put upon the Carmel River?
Jack.
Yes. I don't have the answer.
I have to say, Jack and I started in the first grade, Walter Colton. Jack, it's a piece of it, I don't know the numbers per se, but I do know that it's not the final answer. And then there are all these other questions, as you well know, I'm sure, with desal plants, is the energy consumption and, what do you do with, filtering. It's not the end-all answer. But I do think that what people of the Monterey Peninsula have to be aware of and concerned is, what's the long range, and that's what Jack's getting at, what's the long range solution? Because up till now, we've been told that the long range solutions have been dams on the river. We bought into this in 1948. We bought into it in 1921. That dam is going to last 30 years. Well, my gosh, 30 years is not an eternity, And so that's what we're living with. And engineers will tell you that. I wish I could answer it, but I think it's just a part of it, Jack. Yeah.
Yes, sir. I'm Josh Green. I'm probably one of the youngest in the room, and I'm also one of the newer Carmelians. Only been here a year. So I'm desperately trying to understand the complexities of this particular, love the information. So great talk. You learned me a lot. One question I have when it comes to the water in this area is, what is the overall strategy that you see? Maybe get into people on that. What I mean by strategy is our priority getting water to the people? Is it the priority for golf courses? Is it to make sure the salmon comes in? I mean, where do we rack and stack this? We've got a limited resource here. And if you could be, now again, I want to ask you for solutions, but if you could be king for a day, how would you prioritize that? And then how would we go from there?
I would make it a public entity, first of all. I would decree the water, the people's water, and that's not a name that's attached to a desal plant on Moss Landing. I would do that for sure. I'm a believer in the public owning its resources. I'm more a believer in that we have to take action. We have to get involved. And we're not seeing that. And I hope that might turn around. It's become a desperate time. And maybe people here will start getting involved. But the only way you can get involved in a constructive way is to know your history and to know how we got there, so we don't take and repeat that. What I see happening now, and it's very interesting, this took place this morning in Hopkins, everybody gets lost in all these incredible details, So I consider that sort of a diversionary tactic. You got to pull back from those, I've been gone from here for 10 years. Let me tell you, when I pulled back into the Monterey Peninsula, I had a different vision. I had objectivity that I didn't have when I lived here before. And I always use the word perspective. I had that. If I stay a few more days, I'm probably going to lose it because everybody's so engrossed in, how many gallons of this or how many of that or whatever. The point is that you've got to get involved. Yes?
What do you think about asking half people to leave the peninsula?
I would say we'd go, let's do that on sort of a seniority basis.
Well, I think we've all known, at least I have, the last 15 or 20 years, that the Carmel River was not going to support populations here now, or was even 15 years ago. Why are we not thinking of taking Central Valley water, which is essentially the Sacramento River in the American River? You go up and see those mighty rivers, no dam, there's just tons of water going into the Delta.
Well,
What we would take out of that river wouldn't even be seen.
but that compounds the problem. And let me tell you this: we live in a very rural agricultural county in this state, and I would not suggest to you that you go against the agricultural lobby for that purpose, because you don't have the clout. You wouldn't be able to do it. And why bother? We have to solve our problem locally.
Because the water is there.
But that takes, all that does is give us an excuse to build more, to build out.
Run a aqueduct or pipeline.
Right behind you.
Oh,
Can you take a rare resource and transport it over to an area where it's useful?
Rod? It is Rod, right?
Yes, it is.
Yeah.
That's nice to see you. I'll disagree with my neighbor here. There's, what's happened in Los Angeles, what
Right.
they did with the Owens Valley, what they did with a great deal of things, suck out the water from there.
Yeah.
If one is borrowing water from other places,
Mhm.
indeed, one person's gain is another person's loss.
Absolutely.
And you were talking about details. There are really two fundamental matters that seems to be not details. One is the West is drying up.
Mm-hmm.
And the other thing is we've got too many mouths to drink.
Yes. This has been pointed out for years and years. The organization California Tomorrow did this back in the 60s, saying we've got to start curbing back on what we're doing. I think I'm going to get cut off.
You're not going to get cut off, but I will
Oh,
say this.
shoot.
That we have books for sale, and are you still engaged and happy to be asking questions? If you are, that's great. Just kind of tuning in with people to see if that's what you want to do. Yes?
Yes.
Okay, perfect. There you go.
Thank you. There's a question right over here. For questions, don't take things for granted. If you read an article in the newspaper, I can give you an example. And the article says that the Pebble Beach Company is going to build a new resort, 100 rooms, and they're going to add 140 rooms on to the two other resorts that they have. And everybody seems to be really happy, and they happen to buy in to this is the last time.
Oh, yeah.
Somehow or other, I don't know, Rod has a memory. I keep thinking that I've heard that before, but I could be wrong. What it doesn't say, what they're not saying yet, is where are you going to get the water? Where are you going to get the water? Now, there are deals that will get them the water, but you need to know what those deals are. For example, is the Pebble Beach Company building water credits by doing the recycled water for the golf courses? Does Cal-Am have an agreement there in some form? And when would those credits come due? I call them credits. I don't know if they are for sure, but when will those credits come due? Most likely when Cal-Am starts to clean up its act, so that they can free up more water by stopping the desalination plant, for example. So it's a matter of looking behind it. I said that today. I thought your new mayor was a very bright young guy, but it's a lot of the same stuff. People have to stop and ask questions.
In your research, is there a situation which you found your community facing 10, 15, 20 years ago we face today that, in your opinion, is a win-win situation? And so what did they apply that maybe we can look at today and maybe start working towards?
Of a win-win, Not offhand right now. It might very well be there. If there are, it's because people have become activists and gotten involved in doing something about it. But I can't say that there's a model out there, which what you may be getting at. I'm not sure. I'm sorry. Somebody different, right here.
Do you know where the water for the Fort Ord development is coming from? I don't know.
Well, Seaside, and I imagine there's a lot of water out there at Fort Ord. I don't think that they're looking at the Carmel River. I don't know the answer per se to that.
They have due south and they have the seaside.
Yeah.
And I think
Wait, well, back in.
Erosion silted up the reservoir?
Did Bill Gilley put you up to that? No, he didn't? Do you know Bill Gilley? Have you ever met him? No? Are you aware that he's sitting two chairs down from you? Bill, will you raise your hand? Bill is a professor and has a class of what's called holistic biology at Hopkins Marine Station, and I was his guest this morning, and he asked me about that. It's amazing. I've not been able to get to the end of this book, but it takes time for these things. People have questions. The problem with the fires in the forest is, again, a political problem. Like so many things are. There are fires. They're going to happen in there. What's compounded by that is the accumulation of fuel. And as long as there's not prescribed burning in that forest, you're going to have major fires. There's no other way to look at it. And that type of forest, which is sort of not the exact accurate name, it's mostly chaparral, manzanita, and it burns. And that's what happened with the Marble Cone fire. The fuel had built up so intensely that when the lightning strikes hit there, there was enough fuel in approximately a 10-acre area, equivalent to the atomic bomb. And it went off. Now, when the U.S. Forest Service says we would like to do some prescribed burning, what happens? I can tell you what happened. The Monterey County, I think it is, Air Pollution Control or Air Quality District said, we don't want any burning. Well, you're going to pay for it sooner or later, And so, and I wrote this in the book. There was a TV reporter who went out and was up in the Kashawa, and she stopped Forest Service. He was the fire command, and said, "What's the big deal? What are we concerned about here?" And he said, "When it gets into the watershed, you've got a real problem. And if it jumps the watershed, then you've got a big problem because there are people now." And so it's all, we manage, but we mismanage our lands, and we have to look at how we can best manage it. I can tell you for sure, we lived up there, and I remember the Marble Cone fire clearly and going into there after that fire burned. But we did live in Kashawa, and we were one ridge away from the Kirk Creek fire, and there were fire meetings held regularly up there to try to inform everybody of what was going on and to try to ease their anxieties. But in the meantime, people get shut down,
know what to do, so they do nothing.
Bill.
You use the term how the peninsula is a microcosm, and if you think of something like Cadillac Desert or something, the whole
Right.
history of the whole West.
Yes.
I mean, has any major development ever been held up in the history of the West because of lack of water? And if not, is this possibly like a watershed, no pun intended,
Yeah.
that could really make people sort of
Yeah.
step back and say, enough's enough?
That's another question I don't know the answer to for sure. I can tell you that there was a plan at one time to put a dam on the Eel River so that they could move that water. And believe it or not, maybe I shouldn't say it this way, but I will. There were Republican leaders who convinced Reagan that that wasn't a good idea. And the way they convinced him was that it wasn't economical to do it. And he also saw that he could make some points because there was an Indian reservation there and that would save the Indian reservation and so forth. It brings up a point. And I said this, the county we live in right now is, on a ratio, per person ratio basis, the most conservative county in California. The Republican registration is the number one per capita in the state of California. And I once said to a member of the Board of Supervisors, I said, you know what's missing here? We weren't missing Democrats or we weren't missing liberal thinkers. We were missing the Republicans that formed the Planning and Conservation League, for example. We were missing Republicans who were conservation-minded. We were missing the moderate Republican, the liberal Republican. So I'm talking about politics here, you know, but that doesn't exist anymore. It's all us versus them. Period. Okay.
I think our new mayor would agree with me that the most likely solution that's going to get us out of this problem before 2016 ends, which is our drop dead date, is a combination of a smaller desal plant with public oversight, maybe not ownership, aquifer storage and recovery project, which is underway, and the groundwater replenishment project, which is also underway.
What about reclamation?
Reclamation,
Well,
that's the same thing. It's the same as the groundwater replenishment. Okay. Yeah, and they'll all produce enough water to get us over the hump. We can get it all done by 2016. So, you know, there is hope.
My answer to that is part of an old joke. I'm a Democrat, but I didn't vote for the son of a bitch. How many times has Cal-Am been told that they have to meet certain kinds of deadlines? And how many times have those deadlines passed? And how many times has it been extended? You know, I mean, if you stop right now and buy into the latest rhetoric, I'm not saying that they won't perform, but I'm saying you're being foolish if you don't ask and you look at it with a skeptical eye. Now, that's from my journalism experience. I'd make them accountable. And that's another way to get involved, is to make your politicians accountable. Yeah. Yes, ma'am.
This will be your favorite question of the evening.
Oh, you've waited.
How much is the book?
That includes tax. Yes.
That's a big corner.